This is KSL Sunday Edition with Boyd Matheson.
Welcome to Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. Each Sunday we attempt to divide the rage from the reason, elevate the conversation, connect the dots, and make the news make sense. We have conversations with great thinkers, great leaders, and great people making a difference. We talk politics so we can discuss society, and we explore society so we can discuss principles and the people in America who live them. We bring the best and brightest to Utah, and we send the Utah model to our nation's capital and beyond. Well, this week, Utah's 2nd Congressional sent back to Washington a newly elected representative, Celeste Maloy. She was sworn in this week on the floor of the House of Representatives by recently elected Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. We're really pleased to have joining us live from Washington, D.C. After having cast some of the early votes of her time in Congress. Representative Maloy, welcome to Sunday Edition.
Thanks, Boyd. Thanks for inviting me to be on.
So let's start with just the election itself. Obviously, this was a special election after the retirement of Representative Chris Stewart. Give us a little sense. It was a compressed time frame, but what did you learn as you traveled the state, getting ready to actually represent that 2nd Congressional District?
I learned a lot of things. It's kind of hard to think back now to what I didn't know 5 months ago when this started. But one of the first things I learned is that Utah's voters are so engaged and so willing to show up. I mean, this summer it was hot and sweaty, and I was holding events outdoors. And first, the delegates showed up before the convention. I made hundreds of phone calls, and they'd ask questions, they'd talk to me, they'd engage. And then, after the convention, I was trying to have as many events as I could and get in front of as many people as I could. And it was the middle of the summer, and people already had summer plans before they even knew there was going to be an election. But they'd show up and then ask questions, and they'd engage, and then they'd go talk to their neighbors, and they'd put out yard signs. And it was just mind-blowing to me how quickly people were willing to jump in and engage on this special election.
Yeah, it's such an important thing, and it really was the southern part of the state and the rural parts of the state that really showed up and showed out in the election, both in the primary and in the general election, of course, just before Thanksgiving. Give us a little description of those first days in Washington, D.C., and then I want to get specifically to your first speech on the floor of the House.
Well, that was my first day. So I got sworn in on Tuesday. It's now Friday, and it's been great. There's a lot to do. I ran on, I know how Congress works. I can hit the ground running, and I think I have. There's so much to do in the first week. And I got sworn in Tuesday evening at the end of the day. So I took one vote Tuesday night, and then I've had Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday votes. So I'm basically a seasoned member now. It's been 3.5 days.
Yeah, I thought one of the most extraordinary moments during that scene on the floor of the House of Representatives as you were sworn in to represent the 2nd Congressional District was the fact, I think this had to be a first, that a maiden speech on the floor of the House with a reference to the future farmers of America. Give us a little sense of that, why you chose to go with that, and what that specific message means to you as you begin your time in Washington, D.C.
So it was a line from the FFA Creed, which I memorized as a freshman in high school. And I won't tell you how many years ago that was, but it's been a few. And I didn't know that was still in my head, but in the week leading up to being sworn in, that line kept bouncing around in my head. I believe in the promise of better days through better ways. And I went to look it up just to make sure that I was remembering that right. And then the rest of the sentence says, even as the better things we now enjoy are brought to us through the struggles of former years. And I thought, that's so perfect. That's exactly how I feel right now. I'm running because I really do believe in the promise of better days through better ways. But I want to pay respect to the people who came before us, because the days we have are pretty good. The ways we have could use improvement, but they're pretty good if you look at the history of the world. And I don't want to act like we're inventing something new here.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to both tip the cap to where we've been. But I do think there are some great opportunities for that Utah way, that Utah model to be showcased there in our nation's capital. So as you've had your early conversations, I know you're just a few days into the job. I know you're still trying to figure out the office space and where everything fits there in Washington. But how are you having conversations with your colleagues back there in Washington, and maybe a little bit of that better way Utah model?
Yeah, One thing that's been fun is since I gave that first speech on the House floor and referenced the FFA creed, I think every member of Congress who was in FFA in high school has approached me and recited part of the FFA creed to me. So good news, there are a lot of members of Congress who memorized the creed at some point in their lives and were involved in FFA. That makes me feel good about the future of this country. But I've had a lot of interactions already with other members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. And one of the things a lot of them have told me is that, sometimes people get up and they give their first speech and they want to sort of tell everybody else what they think has been going wrong and come in hot, sort of, and tell the rest of Congress how they should have done things differently. And I think a lot of them appreciated the approach of, showing some appreciation for the people who are already here and have already been doing the hard work. And so I think I got off to a good start with my colleagues.
And as you look at that better way, obviously there's a lot of contention. There's a lot of red-hot rhetoric on both sides of the political aisle, especially as we go into a contentious end of the year with a whole host of things that Congress needs to get done before adjourning for the balance of the year. What are some of the conversations that you are having, and what is your approach with that better way to maybe elevate the dialogue just a little bit and change the dynamic in terms of those conversations, especially on contentious issues?
Yeah, I've talked about this a lot as a candidate, and now I'm getting a chance to practice it as a member. I like talking about policy, I like talking about principles, and I like to avoid talking about people. I don't like finger pointing. There are sometimes you have to say this person's wrong, but I think a lot of times it's just easier to contrast, this is what our side does and the other side's bad for this reason, or I did this because I disagree with this person for this reason. And I've tried to talk principles. I did this for these reasons. I did this because it aligns with these principles. And I do think that's a better way. It takes more work for both the member of Congress who's explaining it and for the public who's listening. But I think it's a better way. I think it gets us to a place where we're doing things for principled reasons instead of doing things because we don't like people or because the other side did something.
Yeah, having that principle and policy discussion first, that's definitely the beginning of a better way and a better day in our nation's capital, to be sure. And I appreciate the fact, Representative, that you've asked us all to look a little harder, both as those in Congress and all of us who are watching here from home, and those of us who are consuming news, that we have to watch for those nuances as well, so that we can get past just the rhetoric and the finger pointing and actually get to the better way, good principles and good policy. Well, we're going to stay with the conversation with newly minted Congresswoman Celeste Maloy on Sunday Edition as it continues here on KSL 5 TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. We're staying with the conversation with Representative Celeste Maloy from Utah's 2nd Congressional District, who was elected just before Thanksgiving and just in time for a flurry of activities before Congress adjourns for the holidays. And Representative Maloy, I know this has been a fast and furious, drink out of a fire hose kind of week for you, but I want to get into some of the things that you're working on and dealing with. That's always the challenge back there in Washington, what you want to focus on, what you have to deal with. I know you've voted as we've been recording today, a vote to expel Representative Santos. Give us a little perspective in terms of that conversation.
Yeah, that was a tough one for me. One, it's my first week, and this is a pretty historic vote. But also, I'm usually in favor of not stepping on the voters' toes. The people in New York elected him, and to have Congress expel him means we're sort of overriding their decision. But it's a case of somebody who flouted all of the ethics rules and was unapologetic and did nothing to remedy any of these problems. And Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution says that Congress has the authority to expel members. And in this case, I felt like we had the responsibility to do that. So as a candidate, I talked a lot about how Americans are losing faith in our institutions. And my biggest fear is that we will walk away from the American experiment because we just don't trust our own institutions anymore. And this vote felt like an opportunity to defend our institutions, to say that ethics actually matter, and being a representative is a privilege. It's something very few people in the history of this country have ever gotten to do. And it should be, if we have ethics rules, which we do, then we should be willing to clean our own house.
Yeah, that's such an important thing. We've stress tested this nation in all kinds of things, pandemics and world wars and economic collapse. Stress testing it in the absence of trust, I think, is a big one. So I think the protection of the institution is absolutely paramount. I want to get to some of the things that you focused on, both on the campaign trail, things that your predecessor was going after as well, some of the challenges in our rural communities and some of that fiscal policy. Give us some perspective there.
Yeah, so I've said that my first priority when I got here is going to be to make sure that a lot of the things Congressman Stewart was working on for these local communities stay on track. So one of the big ones is, we had a lot of projects going to improve roads and water systems and power systems for some of these towns in the district that don't have the tax base to be able to afford to do those things, but they're things that local communities are required to do for their residents. So I want to make sure that one of the first things I do, make sure these communities that are expecting this federal help get it. So we've been working this week. I mean, I've had a lot going on this week with voting and setting up staff, but in the midst of all that, we've been reaching out to the committee chairs on the committees that are handling those and making sure those projects are on track. So the people in Utah who have applied for and received a promise of federal help on these projects don't get left hanging.
Yes.
And I think that's really important.
Yeah, no question.
Sorry,
and getting that connection into that staff work that happens inside the district is where the hard work and heavy lifting of governing, I think, really takes place. And I know that's a big focus for you. And I want to take you from the very local inside the district all the way to the international space. Obviously, there's a number of challenges relating to Ukraine, to the Middle East and Israel. Give us some perspective of your conversations in this first week relating to those big international issues.
So the Santos vote has taken up a lot of the oxygen in the room this week. I have had some conversations about those other issues. Mainly what we've talked about is the need to deal with them individually. Throwing them all into one conversation does a disservice to the American people. We need to have a conversation about what aid we're going to send Israel. We need to have a separate conversation about Ukraine funding, whether that's appropriate, and if so, how much. And then we need to have a separate conversation about other types of foreign aid. And I think we're going in a really good direction that way. I know it's frustrating for the American people to see this, these processes play out, but it's an important process that we have to go through.
Yeah, no question. And I know one of the other sausage-making, not always fun to watch processes dealing with a lot of the fiscal issues right here at home. Give us a sense of what to expect in the coming week as it relates to some of the funding components for the government and some of the other work you've got to get done before the holidays.
Yeah, so within the Congress, we're having conversations about timing on those funding bills. We've got a deadline of, I think, January 15th. And Christmas is coming, and there will be, I think they said yesterday, there's 17 legislative days between now and that deadline. So we're having conversations about the timing that has to happen in the House on those votes in order to get it to the Senate, in order to get it to the president in time to not be, having last minute scramble again, so that we're having these separate conversations like I talked about. And they staggered the spending bills specifically so that would happen. So the timing doesn't run out on every type of funding at the same time. So instead of just getting to the last day, throwing together an omnibus and moving on, we're trying to make sure that we're voting on separate funding bills and having the conversations that need to be had, but also doing them quickly and in a timely manner so the American people can move on and stop worrying about this.
Good. And then finally, before I let you go, Congresswoman, give us something that has surprised you in these first few days back in our nation's capital representing the 2nd Congressional District.
One of the things that's been the most surprising is just how excited everybody is to have a new member here. They've been warm and welcoming and wonderful, and also they've been paying attention. When I'm meeting new members, or when I'm meeting other members of Congress, I'm the new one. They know a lot about my race. They know a lot about the process. They were all paying attention when I gave my first speech. I know there's a lot of cynicism out there that, people get up and give a speech in Congress and nobody's actually there and none of us are actually talking to each other. But I've been impressed with how much communication is going on and how many Democrats have come across the aisle to welcome me and tell me how excited they are to work with me. I think we're in better shape than most people think we are.
Fantastic. Newly minted Representative Congresswoman Celeste Maloy representing Utah's 2nd Congressional District. I know it's been a busy and crazy week for you back there in our nation's capital. Thanks for making time for us on Sunday Edition. We hope this is the first of many conversations we have in your time representing the state of Utah. Thanks for joining us today.
Me too. Thanks, Boyd.
All right, we'll be back with more Sunday Edition. When we come back, stay with us. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. When Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered the famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," there were actually many foreign adversaries that really were worth worrying about in the world. And yet FDR said that we shouldn't fear them as much as we should fear fear. Today, many Americans fear the uncertainty of global conflict, racial unrest, political polarization, and economic upheaval. All of these, I believe, the American people are prepared to defeat and actually overcome. What we see more fearful of is losing power or losing control. Fear fosters timidity and creates a climate of avoiding real debate about the real issues of the day. Functioning from a position of fear causes us to demonize those we disagree with and hunker down in our bunkers of self-validating social media bubbles. From Washington to the Wasatch Front, politicians seem to be teeming with a timidity toward asserting and applying the very principles they profess to believe. Many politicians are afraid of their own shadow when it comes to promoting or voting on principles and good policy. This kind of fear is bad for the country and for our communities because it leads our elected officials to actually spend more time spreading fear about their opponents' views than making their own case for what they believe and what they're for. This is particularly evident in the current non-debates we're having in this country about immigration, education, health care, tax reform, and the national debt. So are Republicans really so uncertain about their oft-proclaimed principles of free markets, local control, and fiscal responsibility that they can't even share what they're for when it comes to these policy issues? Now, before the Democrats jump in with a big amen, they should also remember that they spent their 4 years out of power in a fear-driven defensive crouch. Now back in presidential power, but with divided congressional government, they've fearfully retreated to the often deployed, "you may not like us, but you really don't want the Republicans back in power" kind of ploy. So both sides should bring their members to the table for a brave, authentic, honest, and open debate about the future of America. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell are two of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C. So what are they afraid of? I think they're afraid of losing power and their positions. And far too many on both sides of the political aisle fear the same thing. This fear of losing power is at the heart of not only the policy debate debacle in Congress right now, but it's an impediment to every meaningful debate we should be having in this country. Too many elected officials have become enamored with the idea of power while abandoning the power of ideas. Fear leads to a white-knuckled, tight-fisted clinging to power in a zero-sum game approach to governing. Confidence, on the other hand, enables an open-handed and welcoming invitation to explore the possibilities with curiosity. Americans applaud and admire those who are willing to take risk and step into the arena, whether in the field of athletics, business, science, or social entrepreneurship. Rewards are usually commensurate with the risk we're willing to take. Sadly, too many of our politicians have become so risk-averse that they'll never put forward a bold proposal for fear of the possible political costs. Governing by fear leads to every objective or proposal being consultant certified and poll tester approved. That's hardly a path to profiles and courage for our country. So instead of looking fear in the face, many politicians spend their time casting fear and aspersions on their opponents' ideas and policies, instead of putting forward their own solutions based on what they profess to believe. The bravado and bombast are just cover to distract from their fear of losing political power. So if Democrats are really for helping those in poverty, shouldn't they evaluate every government agency and program to ensure they're providing real results that actually make poverty temporary instead of just tolerable? what are Democrats afraid of? And if Republicans really have compassion for those struggling on the streets, shouldn't they evaluate what the government can and should do for those who are suffering while tackling things like corporate welfare and their own out-of-control spending habits? So what are Republicans afraid of? Well, there are countless other examples, including business regulation, military spending, LGBT rights, tax reform, religious liberties, and immigration, where we can rightly and often sadly see that the fearful political rhetoric of both parties is more about self-preservation than it is about producing results for the American people. Now, as citizens, we also have to ask, what are we afraid of? I've said on this program before that while we complain and criticize our elected officials for their timid approach, we never hold any of them accountable. Incumbents are re-elected at the rate of about 94% each election cycle. So are we afraid to hold them accountable for fear that we might lose power or influence in Washington, D.C.? That's what they tell us. Unfortunately, with our votes, we're validating bad behavior out of fear. Perpetually re-electing the same people who are playing the same old game to hold on to power is cowardly on our part as citizens and as voters. We reinforce that it's better to play it safe, to hunker down, to shout at the opposition and get reelected than it is to boldly lead and stand on principle and stand for good public policy. So to paraphrase Rudyard Kipling, of all the liars in the world, the worst are your own fears. The test for the American people is to quit believing the lies of fear. We must challenge our political parties and political leaders to demonstrate behavior that lives up to the principles they profess to believe. Our true commitment to freedom will be revealed not by what we declare in fear, but by what we bravely do in spite of fear. It's time for us individually and as a nation to look fear in the face and then boldly act together. We can work together to deal with the state of government and the state of our politics, but I firmly believe that we're more united than many politicians and pundits are willing to proclaim. Our people are more powerful than we suppose, and the state of the nation and the state of the union is stronger than we can imagine. Well, that wraps it up for Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. Thanks for joining us today. And as always, as you go out into the world, make sure you see something that inspires, say something that uplifts, and do something that makes a difference. Music and the spoken word is next.